A wealthy rancher wagered $300,000 that no soul could stand within arm's reach of the wild black stallion they called Midnight for more than 30 seconds. Professional bronc riders crumbled. Champion horse trainers retreated bloody and bruised. The crowd screamed for violence and glory. But then came Thomas Whitfield, a grieving dairy farmer with hands scarred by loss and a heart too tired for showmanship. No ropes, no bridles, no weapons of dominance. Just 60 seconds that would alter the course of a town, a horse, and a man who had forgotten how to hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The September sun hung heavy over Willow Creek, Montana, the kind of brightness that made everything look sharper, harder, more real than anyone wanted. Dust rolled across the Drummond Ranch fairgrounds in lazy spirals, coating boots and belt buckles, and the brims of hats tilted against the glare. The timber fence posts, hewn from lodgepole pine and weathered by a dozen winters, creaked under the press of bodies. Hundreds had come from towns with names like Kalispell and Whitefish, from ranches tucked into valleys where cell service died and neighbors lived 10 miles apart. They leaned against the rails or perched on makeshift bleachers hammered together that morning, their voices rising in waves of speculation and bravado. Vendors worked the edges of the crowd, hawking corn dogs and lemonade that sweated through paper cups. The smell of frying onions tangled with the musk of horses and the faint bite of pine resin heating in the sun. Children darted between legs, their laughter shrill and careless, while their parents clutched crumpled bills and debated odds with the fervor of gamblers at a racetrack. Above it all, a banner stretched between two posts, red letters on white canvas announcing the event in language too bold to ignore. $300,000 challenge. 30 seconds with the Black Devil. Victor Drummond presence. Victor Drummond stood at the center of it all, a man whose presence filled space the way smoke fills a closed room. He wore a black Stetson with a band of braided silver, a shirt pressed so crisp it might have been starched twice, and boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dirt everywhere else. His belt buckle, wide as a fist, caught the light every time he turned, a trophy from some rodeo 20 years gone. He climbed onto a platform erected near the main gate, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no and meant it. A microphone stood waiting, and when he wrapped his hand around it, the feedback screech cut through the crowd noise like a blade through cloth. The talking died in uneven patches, voices dropping until only the restless shuffle of boots and the distant whinny of a horse remained. Victor let the silence stretch, savoring it, his grin wide and wolfish. He was a man who understood theater, who knew that power was as much about timing as it was about money. When he finally spoke, his voice rolled out smooth and thick, like honey poured over gravel. $300,000, he said, letting each word settle before continuing. That is what I am offering today to any man, woman, or fool brave enough to step into that ring and stand within 3 feet of Midnight for 30 seconds. Not ride him, not break him, just stand there, close enough to feel his breath, close enough to touch. A murmur rippled through the crowd, excitement threading through disbelief. Some people laughed nervously. Others exchanged glances that said they thought Victor had finally lost his mind. But most leaned forward, hungry for what came next. Victor pointed toward the far gate with a flourish, his grin sharpening. 30 seconds. That is all. No ropes allowed. No weapons. No tricks. Just you and him. He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd with a predator's patience. But I warn you now, that animal has sent better men than you to the hospital. He has shattered ribs, dislocated shoulders, and broken the will of every so-called expert who thought they could master him. So if you are smart, you will sit right where you are and enjoy the show. The gate rattled. Metal clanged against metal, a sound sharp enough to make several people flinch. Then the double doors swung wide, and Midnight exploded into the arena. He was not simply black. He was the absence of light given form. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian, so dark that shadows pooled along the curves of his muscles. He was a Frisian, bred for strength and presence, standing 17 hands tall with a neck arched like a drawn bow and a mane that cascaded in waves down his shoulder. But beauty was not what people saw first. What they saw was fury. His eyes rolled white at the edges, nostrils flared wide, and when he reared, his front hooves slashed the air with the precision of a weapon. The sound of his scream tore through the fairgrounds, raw and primal, the kind of sound that bypassed reason and went straight to the part of the brain that remembered when humans were prey. Dust exploded around his hooves when he landed, and he spun, his massive body moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The crowd pulled back from the rails instinctively, a collective recoil born of survival. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men who had swaggered minutes before now stood silent, their faces pale. Even the vendors stopped their hawking, frozen by the spectacle. Victor watched it all with satisfaction, his cigar glowing like a small ember between his fingers. That, he announced, his voice crackling through the speakers, is Midnight. Some call him the Black Devil. Others call him unbreakable. I call him $300,000 you will never earn. The first challenger did not wait long. A young man, maybe 25, swung over the rail with the kind of reckless confidence that came from too many beers and not enough sense. He wore a championship buckle from a rodeo circuit in Wyoming, and his friends cheered as he strutted into the arena, rope coiled over his shoulder. He moved like a man who had been thrown before and gotten back up, like someone who believed pain was just part of the price. For 10 seconds, it looked like he might have a chance. He circled wide, keeping his body angled, his rope hand steady. Midnight tracked him with ears pinned flat, head low, every muscle coiled tight. Then the stallion charged. It was not a gallop. It was an assault. His hooves struck the ground like hammers on anvils, and when he reached the young man, he did not slow. He spun, his hindquarters coming around faster than thought, and one rear hoof caught the man square in the ribs. The sound was audible even over the crowd, a dull, wet crack that made stomachs turn. The young man went down hard, gasping, his rope forgotten in the dirt. 2 ranch hands vaulted the fence and dragged him out before Midnight could circle back. The crowd erupted, half in horror, half in savage excitement, and Victor only smiled, tapping ash from his cigar. Next, an older man stepped forward. He had the look of someone who had spent decades around horses, his face lined and leathered, his hands scarred from a lifetime of ropes and reins. He carried no tools, only his voice, low and steady, the kind of tone meant to soothe. He moved slowly, arms loose at his sides, speaking in a continuous murmur. For a moment, Midnight seemed to hesitate. His ears flicked forward, just a fraction, as if considering. The crowd held its breath. Then the stallion lunged. He did not strike this time. He simply drove forward, chest first, and the force of it knocked the older man off his feet. He hit the ground rolling, instinct taking over, and he scrambled for the fence with Midnight snapping at his heels. He made it out, shaken but whole. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And the crowd exhaled in a mixture of relief and disappointment. 3 more tried. A woman with a background in natural horsemanship, moving in careful arcs and avoiding eye contact. A rodeo clown who thought humor and unpredictability might confuse the stallion. A ranch foreman who came in with a feed bucket, hoping hunger might overcome fury. All of them failed. Some left bruised. One left bleeding. All left humbled. Victor climbed back onto his platform as the last challenger limped away. He spread his arms wide, his grin triumphant. You see? Unbreakable. Untouchable. Worth every penny I have wagered. His voice carried across the fairgrounds, over the murmuring crowd and the distant hum of the highway. Not one of you will last 30 seconds. But please keep trying. I could use the entertainment. The crowd began to shift, some people drifting toward the exits, others settling in for the long haul, convinced that someone, eventually, would find a way. Bets changed hands. Arguments flared and faded. The sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter. At the far edge of the arena, almost unnoticed in the chaos, A teenage girl named Katie Jensen stood on the bottom rail of the fence, her phone held steady in both hands. She had been filming since the first challenger entered, her thumb hovering over the record button, her eyes never leaving midnight. She was 16, with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail and dirt on her jeans from helping her mother set up their booth at the Saturday market that morning. She wanted to be a veterinarian, though her family did not have the money for college, and she had not yet figured out how to make that dream real. But she loved animals the way some people loved music or math, with a passion that did not require explanation. She watched Midnight pace the arena, his body tense, his movements sharp and erratic. But Katie saw something others missed. She saw the way his ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds, searching for threats. She saw the way he flinched when the loudspeakers crackled, the way he shied from the shadow of the banner flapping overhead. She saw fear beneath the fury. She whispered into her phone, her voice barely audible over the crowd. He is not evil. He is terrified. Look at his eyes. He is just trying to survive. No one heard her. The noise swallowed her words. But she kept filming, kept watching because she believed that someone, somewhere would see what she saw. And maybe that would matter. Miles away, in a valley where the land rolled gently and the grass grew thick between stands of aspen, Thomas Whitfield knelt in his dairy barn, his hands wrapped around the leg of a calf that had been born that morning. The calf was weak, struggling to stand, and Thomas worked with patient hands, checking for injury, for fever, for anything that might explain the trembling. His own hands were scarred, the knuckles thick from years of labor, the fingernails permanently stained. He was 47 years old, though he looked older. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, the kind that came not from laughter but from carrying weight. 4 years ago, his son Jacob had died. It had been a bright summer afternoon, the kind of day when the world felt impossibly alive. Jacob, 17 and strong and so sure of himself, had been working alone in the upper field, mowing hay. The tractor had rolled on uneven ground. By the time Thomas reached him, it was already too late. The funeral had been held on a Thursday, and Thomas remembered almost nothing of it except the sound of his wife sobbing, and the way the coffin looked too small to hold all the future that had been stolen. His wife had left 6 months later. Not because she stopped loving him, but because the farm had become a grave she could not escape. She lived in Missoula now, teaching elementary school, and they spoke occasionally on the phone in careful, distant tones. Thomas stayed because he did not know what else to do. The cows needed milking. The fields needed tending. Grief did not pause for logistics. He finished with the calf, stroking its head once before standing. His knees ached. Everything ached. He washed his hands in the utility sink, the water cold enough to sting, and dried them on a towel that had seen better years. From the corner of the barn, a radio muttered static and fragments of news. He usually ignored it, but today a voice cut through clear and sharp. Willow Creek, Drummond Ranch Fairgrounds, $300,000 wager. Wild stallion. No one has lasted 30 seconds. Thomas paused, his hands still on the towel. He stared at the radio as if it might explain itself. $300,000. The number sat in his mind like a stone. He thought of the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table, the mortgage notice that had arrived last week, the tractor that needed a new transmission, the feed costs that climbed every season. $300,000 would not solve everything, but it would buy time. It would buy breath. He told himself it was foolish. He told himself he had no business getting involved in something like that. But when he climbed into his truck an hour later, a bushel of apples from his small orchard sitting in the passenger seat, he turned toward Willow Creek instead of the Saturday market where he usually sold them. He told himself he was just curious, that he would take a look and leave, that it meant nothing. The road stretched before him, winding through valleys where the aspens had begun to turn gold, their leaves trembling in the breeze. The sky above was a blue so deep it hurt to look at, and the mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. Thomas drove with the windows down, the air cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. He thought about Jacob, He thought about the sound of his son's laughter. He thought about how silence had become the loudest thing in his life. By the time he reached Willow Creek, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western peaks. The Drummond Ranch Fairgrounds sat on the edge of town, a sprawling complex of timber buildings and corrals that Victor Drummond had built with oil money and land deals. Trucks lined the gravel lots, their beds filled with hay bales and toolboxes and the debris of working lives. Thomas parked at the far end, away from the crowd, and sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled. He could hear the noise from here, the roar of voices, the occasional cheer, the metallic clang of gates. He climbed out, his boots crunching on gravel, and walked toward the fairgrounds with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders hunched against a wind that was not there. The crowd was massive, bigger than anything Willow Creek usually drew. Thomas edged his way through, murmuring apologies, until he found a spot near the rail where he could see. The arena stretched before him, red dirt churned and scarred, the timber fence worn smooth by years of use. And in the center, pacing with the restless energy of a storm barely contained, was Midnight. Thomas had spent his life around animals. He knew cattle, knew their rhythms and moods, knew how to read the tilt of a head or the shift of weight. Horses were different, but not so different that he could not see what others missed. He watched Midnight move, watched the tension in every stride, the way the stallion's head swung toward every sound, every movement. He saw a creature trapped in a nightmare it could not escape. And something in Thomas, something buried beneath 4 years of grief and exhaustion, stirred. Not hope, not yet, but recognition. He knew what it felt like to be afraid and angry and unable to find a way out. He knew what it felt like to be something people looked at but did not see. He stayed at the rail long after most of the crowd had drifted away, long after Victor Drummond had climbed down from his platform and disappeared into the main lodge. He stayed until the sun touched the mountains and the shadows grew long and the stallion finally stopped pacing and stood in the center of the arena, sides heaving, head low. Thomas did not know yet that he would enter that ring. He did not know yet that his life was about to change in ways he could not imagine. But as he turned to leave, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still something in this world worth trying for. The morning came cold and clear, the kind of September dawn that carried the promise of winter in its breath. Frost clung to the grass at the edges of the Drummond Ranch Fairgrounds, melting slowly as the sun climbed over the eastern ridges. By the time the gates opened at 8, the crowd had already begun to gather, thicker than the day before, drawn by word of mouth and social media posts that had spread through the valley like wildfire. Katie Jensen's shaky footage from the previous afternoon had been shared hundreds of times overnight, accompanied by breathless commentary and speculation. People wanted to see the stallion. They wanted to see someone win, or more truthfully, they wanted to see someone lose in spectacular fashion. Victor Drummond arrived in a black pickup truck that gleamed as though it had been detailed that morning, which it probably had. He stepped out wearing a different Stetson, this one charcoal gray with a band of turquoise and silver, and boots that had never seen a day of actual ranch work. His belt buckle caught the morning light, a different one from yesterday, this time depicting a bull rider frozen midbuck. He moved through the crowd shaking hands, clapping shoulders, his smile wide and confident. He was a man in his element, a showman who understood that spectacle was currency and attention was profit. The platform had been reinforced overnight, the microphone replaced with a newer model that did not squeal with feedback. When Victor climbed up and tapped it, the sound was clean and sharp, cutting through the murmur of voices like a knife through fabric. The crowd quieted, faces turning upward, hundreds of eyes reflecting anticipation and greed and a hunger for something they could not name. "Good morning, Willow Creek," Victor began, his voice booming across the fairgrounds. "I see we have even more brave souls today, or should I say foolish souls." He paused for the laughter, which came dutifully, rolling through the crowd in waves. "Yesterday we saw what Midnight is capable of. We saw grown men reduced to children. We saw professionals humbled. And yet, the $300,000 remains unclaimed. He let that number hang in the air, heavy and glittering, a lure that hooked into the imagination of everyone listening. $300,000. In a town where the median household income hovered around $45,000 a year, where family farms were failing and Main Street businesses were closing and young people left for cities because there was no future in staying, that sum represented something beyond money. It represented escape. It represented possibility. It represented a different life entirely. Today, Victor continued, we continue the challenge. 30 seconds. 3 feet. No tools, no tricks. Just you and the devil himself. He gestured toward the holding pen where Midnight waited, his dark form visible through the slats. I have brought in additional medical personnel, because unlike some of you, I care about safety. He grinned, and the crowd chuckled uncertainly, not entirely sure whether he was joking. Dr. Rebecca Holland, our local equine veterinarian and behavioral specialist, will be supervising to ensure the animal's welfare. Deputy Frank Morrison will be present to ensure fair play. And I have doubled the insurance policy because I am a generous man. The crowd applauded, though whether they were applauding his generosity or simply the promise of more violence was unclear. Victor descended from the platform, his boots thudding against the timber steps, and made his way to the arena rail where Dr. Rebecca Holland stood with a clipboard and a neutral expression. Rebecca Holland was 38 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid and a face that showed more sun and wind than makeup. She wore jeans, work boots, and a canvas jacket with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hands were steady, her gaze direct, and she had the kind of quiet competence that came from years of dealing with animals that could kill you if you made a mistake. She had been practicing veterinary medicine in Willow Creek for a decade, and she knew Victor Drummond well enough to distrust everything he said and verify everything he did. "Victor," she said without preamble, her voice low enough that only those nearby could hear, "if that horse shows signs of distress beyond normal arousal, I am stopping this." Victor's smile did not falter. "Of course, doctor. Animal welfare is my top priority. You know that." Rebecca's expression suggested she knew no such thing, but she said nothing further. She turned her attention to the holding pen, watching Midnight pace in tight circles, his head tossing, his tail lashing. She had examined him 2 days prior at Victor's request, ostensibly to ensure he was healthy enough for the challenge. What she had found troubled her. The stallion bore old scars, signs of rough handling, and a reactivity that spoke of trauma rather than temperament. She had recommended against the event entirely, but Victor had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand and a reminder that he owned the horse and could do as he pleased within the bounds of the law. Deputy Frank Morrison stood near the gate, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his face impassive beneath the brim of his campaign hat. Frank was 52, a lifelong resident of Willow Creek, and a man who believed in the law the way some people believed in scripture. He did not particularly like Victor Drummond, but he had reviewed the permits and found them in order, reviewed the liability waivers and found them comprehensive, and reviewed the medical preparations and found them adequate. There was nothing illegal about what was happening here, even if it left a bad taste in his mouth. The first challenger of the day was a man named Garrett Cole, a professional horse trainer from Kalispell with credentials that included work with rescue animals and problem horses. He was 41, lean and weathered, with the kind of confidence that came from genuine skill rather than bravado. He had arrived early, spoken quietly with Rebecca, and spent an hour observing Midnight from outside the pen. When he finally entered the arena, he moved with deliberate slowness, his body language carefully neutral. Garrett understood horses. He understood that prey animals read intention before they read action, that stillness could communicate safety, that patience was a tool as valuable as any rope or halter. He carried nothing in his hands. He did not look directly at Midnight but rather past him, his gaze soft and unfocused. He breathed slowly, audibly, establishing a rhythm. The crowd, sensing something different, fell into an expectant hush. Midnight stopped pacing. His ears swiveled forward, tracking Garrett's position. The stallion's nostrils flared, testing the air, reading the scent of this new human. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Garrett stood in place, his weight balanced, his breathing steady. Midnight took one step toward him, then another. The crowd leaned forward collectively, breath held, as the distance between man and horse shrank. At 15 seconds, Midnight's head lowered slightly, a gesture that in calmer circumstances might have indicated curiosity or acceptance. Garrett remained perfectly still, allowing the horse to close the distance at his own pace. 20 seconds. The stallion was now within 6 feet, close enough that Garrett could see the flecks of brown in his dark eyes, close enough to hear the rhythm of his breathing. Then somewhere in the crowd, a child's balloon popped. The sound was sharp and sudden, a gunshot crack that shattered the fragile calm. Midnight's head snapped up, his eyes rolling white, and in an instant the curiosity vanished, replaced by pure panic. He reared, his front hooves slashing upward, and Garrett dove to the side, hitting the dirt hard and rolling toward the fence. Midnight came down like a thunderclap, his hooves striking the ground inches from where Garrett's head had been. The trainer scrambled under the bottom rail, breathing hard, his shirt torn and his face pale. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps and disappointed groans. Victor's voice cut through the noise, amplified and jovial. "So close. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the best attempt yet. But as you can see, even the professionals cannot master this animal." Rebecca climbed through the rails and knelt beside Garrett, checking him for injuries. He waved her off, his pride wounded more than his body, and walked stiffly toward the medical tent that had been set up near the concessions. The crowd's attention shifted immediately, already looking for the next source of entertainment. The second challenger was a woman named Perched, who ran a therapeutic riding program for children with disabilities out of her small ranch near Columbia Falls. She was in her mid-50s, with gray streaking her blonde hair and hands that bore the calluses of decades of physical work. She had come not for the money, though she could certainly use it, but because she believed that every horse deserved a chance at rehabilitation, and she thought perhaps she could be the one to give Midnight that chance. And entered the arena carrying nothing but a soft cotton lead rope coiled loosely in one hand, not to use but to offer, a symbol of connection rather than control. She had worked with traumatized horses before, animals that had been beaten or neglected or simply broken by the world. She knew that healing took time, that trust could not be forced, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was simply be present without demanding anything in return. She spoke to Midnight in a low, continuous murmur, her voice carrying the cadence of a lullaby. The words themselves did not matter, only the tone, the gentleness, the absence of threat. She moved in a wide arc, never approaching directly, always giving him space to retreat. Midnight watched her with ears pinned back, his muscles coiled tight, his breathing rapid and shallow. But he did not charge. He did not rear. He simply watched, and for a moment it seemed as though and might succeed where others had failed. She was within 10 feet when Midnight suddenly lunged sideways, not at her but away from her, as though something invisible had struck him. His body slammed into the fence with a force that made the timber groan, and he spun, wild-eyed, searching for the threat that existed only in his mind, and froze, her heart hammering, and slowly began to back away. She knew the signs of a flashback, had seen it in horses that had been abused, the way past trauma could erupt into the present without warning. This was not a horse she could help in 30 seconds. This was a horse that needed months, maybe years of patient rehabilitation. She left the arena quietly, her head down, and when a reporter tried to shove a microphone in her face, she pushed it away without speaking. Rebecca caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture of respect between two women who understood that some battles could not be won with good intentions alone. The third challenger was younger, a man barely into his 20s named Kyle Reeves, who worked as a ranch hand on one of the larger cattle operations outside of town. He had been bull riding since he was 14, had broken bones and gotten back on, and he approached the challenge with the reckless confidence of someone too young to fully believe in his own mortality. He vaulted the fence with a whoop, landed in the dirt with his arms spread wide, and grinned at the crowd, as though this were a performance rather than a test. Kyle's strategy, if it could be called that, was movement. He darted left, then right, keeping Midnight's attention split, trying to confuse the stallion with unpredictability. For a few seconds, it almost worked. Midnight's head swung back and forth, tracking the motion, uncertain how to respond. But horses are not confused for long, and prey animals do not tolerate chaos. Midnight's confusion shifted rapidly to aggression, and when Kyle darted too close, the stallion's teeth caught the shoulder of his shirt, ripping fabric and skin. Kyle yelped, stumbling backward, and Midnight followed, driving him toward the fence with the relentless pressure of a predator. Kyle hit the rails hard, felt them shudder under the impact, and barely managed to roll under the bottom rail before Midnight's hooves came down where his legs had been. He came up on the other side bleeding and shaking, his bravado shattered, and the medical personnel rushed forward to wrap his shoulder and check for deeper damage. Victor climbed back onto his platform, his expression one of theatrical sympathy. "Folks, I want to remind everyone that all challengers have signed comprehensive waivers. We have medical staff on site. We are taking every precaution. But this is not a petting zoo. This is a challenge, and challenges come with risk." The crowd murmured, some people shifting uncomfortably, others leaning in with renewed interest. The line of people waiting to sign waivers and take their turn had not diminished. If anything, it had grown. There was something intoxicating about the spectacle, something darkly compelling about watching people test themselves against an animal that represented pure, unfiltered wildness. The fourth challenger was a man in his 60s, a retired rodeo champion named Earl Hutchins who had once been famous on the circuit, though his name meant little to anyone under 40. He moved slowly, his joints stiff from old injuries, but his eyes were sharp and his hands steady. He had broken more horses than most people had ridden, and he believed that experience counted for something, that the old ways still had value in a world that seemed to change too fast. Earl entered the arena without fanfare, without showmanship. He simply walked to the center, planted his feet, and waited. His strategy was stillness, not the active stillness of Garrett Cole's approach, but the passive stillness of a man who had learned that sometimes doing nothing was the hardest and most effective action. He did not look at Midnight. He did not speak. He simply stood, his arms loose at his sides, his breathing slow and even. Midnight approached, wary but curious. He circled Earl once, then twice, his hooves stirring up small clouds of dust. The old man did not turn to follow the movement, did not track the stallion with his eyes. He simply stood, and for a moment it seemed as though his sheer immobility might be enough. 20 seconds passed. 25. The crowd held its breath. At 28 seconds, Midnight suddenly reared, not in aggression but in what looked almost like frustration, as though the old man's refusal to react was somehow more threatening than active confrontation. His hooves came down hard, close enough that Earl had to step back, and in that moment of broken stillness, the spell was shattered. Midnight wheeled away, snorting, and Earl walked calmly toward the gate, his face expressionless. He had come closer than anyone, but close was not enough. The failures continued through the morning and into the afternoon. A young woman who worked with rescue horses. A man who claimed to have learned horse whispering from a Blackfeet elder. A pair of brothers who thought teamwork might succeed where individual effort had failed. All of them left the arena defeated, some bruised, some bleeding, all humbled. Katie Jensen filmed every attempt, her phone battery dying twice and requiring her to borrow a portable charger from a vendor. She had stopped narrating her videos, stopped trying to explain what she saw, because the truth was becoming harder to articulate. What she saw was a horse in agony. Not physical agony but something deeper, a creature trapped in a loop of fear and aggression that he could not escape. And she saw a crowd that seemed less interested in understanding than in being entertained by suffering. She lowered her phone at one point, her hands shaking, and whispered to herself, "This is wrong. This is so wrong." But no one heard her, and even if they had, she was 16 and her voice carried no weight in a world run by men like Victor Drummond. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the arena, Victor Drummond made his way back to the platform for what he announced would be the final session of the day. The crowd had thinned slightly, some families leaving as dinner time approached, but hundreds remained, their faces flushed with sun and excitement and the peculiar exhaustion that came from watching violence without participating in it. Victor's voice had taken on a hoarse edge, but his enthusiasm remained undiminished. My friends, we have seen courage today. We have seen skill and determination and perhaps a bit of foolishness. But we have not seen success. The $300,000 remains unclaimed, and Midnight remains undefeated. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the crowd. Tomorrow we continue. Tomorrow someone will step into that arena and prove me wrong. Or perhaps, he grinned, they will simply prove me right once again. The crowd began to disperse as the sun touched the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue. Vendors packed up their grills and coolers. Families herded tired children toward parking lots. The noise that had dominated the day faded into the quieter sounds of evening. The creak of truck doors, the murmur of exhausted conversation, the distant call of a hawk riding the thermals above the valley. Thomas Whitfield had returned. He stood at the same spot he had occupied the evening before, his hands resting on the top rail, his eyes fixed on Midnight. The stallion paced the arena alone now, his sides dark with sweat, his breathing still elevated from the day's chaos. Thomas watched the way he moved, the way his ears swiveled constantly, the way he startled at shadows that held no threat. He watched and he understood. He understood because he had spent 4 years moving through the world the same way, flinching at sounds that reminded him of that day, avoiding places that carried memories, existing in a constant state of vigilance that exhausted the soul. He understood what it meant to be trapped inside your own fear, unable to explain it to anyone, unable to escape it no matter how far you ran. Rebecca Holland noticed him standing there. She had been packing her medical kit, preparing to leave, when something about the way he stood caught her attention. She walked over, her boots crunching on gravel, and leaned against the rail beside him. They stood in silence for a long moment before she spoke. "You have been here both days," she said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded without looking at her. "I have." Rebecca studied his profile, the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. "You thinking about trying?" Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I am thinking that everyone has been trying to conquer him, trying to prove something, but nobody has tried just being with him." Rebecca considered this. "You know horses?" "Cattle mostly," Thomas replied. "But pain is pain. Fear is fear. Does not matter if you have 2 legs or 4. Rebecca turned to face him fully. "What is your name?" "Thomas Whitfield." She held out her hand. "Rebecca Holland. I am the vet on site. And for what it is worth, I think you are right. Everyone who has gone in there today has been trying to dominate or impress or prove something. Not one of them has simply tried to understand." Thomas shook her hand, her grip firm and dry. "Understanding takes time," he said. 30 seconds is not enough." "Then maybe," Rebecca said carefully, "you should ask for more." Thomas looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "He can do that?" "Victor Drummond can do whatever he wants. He owns the horse. He makes the rules. And I think," she continued, her voice dropping lower, "that he is getting bored. The crowd is getting restless. People want to see something different. If you approached him the right way, proposed something unusual, he might agree just for the novelty." "Why would you help me?" Thomas asked. "Because," Rebecca said, looking back at Midnight, "that horse deserves better than this. And I think maybe you do too." She walked away before Thomas could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the darkening sky. He stayed until the lights came on around the fairgrounds, harsh sodium vapor lamps that turned the world orange and flat. He stayed until Midnight finally stopped pacing and stood in the center of the arena with his head low, exhausted by a day of fear and aggression that had been forced upon him for entertainment. Thomas drove home in darkness, the truck's headlights cutting tunnels through the night. He thought about Rebecca's words. He thought about the $300,000 and what it could mean for his farm. But mostly he thought about the look in Midnight's eyes, the wild panic that masked something deeper, something wounded. When he pulled into his driveway, the farmhouse was dark and cold. He sat in the truck for a long time before going inside, and when he finally did, he did not turn on the lights. He simply sat at the kitchen table in the darkness, his scarred hands folded in front of him, and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would go back. Tomorrow he would speak to Victor Drummond. Tomorrow he would ask for what no one else had thought to ask for. Not 30 seconds of dominance, but time. Time to listen. Time to understand. Time to see if a broken man and a broken horse might find in each other something neither had been able to find alone. Outside, the September wind moved through the valley, carrying with it the scent of turning leaves and coming winter. The stars burned cold and bright overhead, indifferent to human struggle, bearing witness to nothing and everything. And somewhere between the farm and the fairgrounds, between past and future, Thomas Whitfield held onto the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. The alarm clock rattled at 4:30 in the morning, though Thomas had been awake for over an hour, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom while shadows slowly retreated from the corners. Sleep had become something he negotiated with rather than surrendered to, a bargain he rarely won. He reached over and silenced the clock before it could complete its angry percussion, then swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet finding the cold floorboards. The house held the particular silence of a place where too few people lived, where rooms went unused and conversations happened only in memory. He dressed in the dark by habit, pulling on jeans worn soft at the knees and a flannel shirt that had belonged to Jacob. Thomas had not meant to keep wearing his son's clothes, but after his wife left, he had found comfort in the way the fabric still held a shape that was not quite his own, as though by wearing it he could somehow keep Jacob present in the world. The rational part of his mind knew this was foolish, but grief had long ago taught him that rational and bearable were not the same thing. The dairy barn was a short walk from the house, close enough that he had made the journey in blizzards and thunderstorms and every kind of weather that Montana could conjure. His boots crunched across gravel still wet with dew, and when he pulled open the barn door, the familiar smell rolled over him, a mixture of hay and milk and the warm animal scent of the 37 Holsteins that depended on him for their survival. They shifted in their stalls as he entered, their movements creating a symphony of small sounds, hooves on concrete, chains rattling, the soft lowing that meant they recognized him and expected food. Thomas moved through the morning routine with the efficiency of long practice. He filled the feed troughs with a mixture of grain and alfalfa, checked water levels, made notes on a clipboard about which cows needed attention from the veterinarian. One of the older girls, a cow he had named Rosie, though she bore an official identification number, had been limping yesterday. He knelt beside her now, running his hands down her front left leg, feeling for heat or swelling. She tolerated his examination with patient indifference, more interested in her breakfast than his concern. The milking took 2 hours even with the automated system he had installed 5 years ago, back when the farm was still making enough profit to justify investment. He moved from stall to stall, attaching the suction cups, monitoring flow rates, checking for any signs of mastitis or injury. The work was meditative in its repetition, the kind of labor that occupied the hands while leaving the mind free to wander. And this morning, Thomas's mind wandered relentlessly back to the black stallion pacing an arena in Willow Creek. He had spent half the night researching Frisian horses on his ancient laptop, the one with the cracked screen that took 5 minutes to boot up. He learned that they were a Dutch breed, originally bred as warhorses in medieval times, later refined for dressage and driving. They were known for their intelligence, their sensitivity, their strong bonds with handlers. The articles emphasized that Frisians were not naturally aggressive, that they thrived on partnership and communication, that rough handling could damage them in ways that were difficult to repair. The more he read, the more convinced he became that Midnight's behavior was not temperament but trauma. Something had broken that horse's trust in humans so thoroughly that he saw every interaction as a threat. And Thomas understood that kind of breaking, understood it in a way that made his chest ache. He had been whole once, had moved through the world with the easy confidence of a man who believed that hard work and love were enough to protect the people he cared about. Jacob's death had shattered that belief, and what remained was a kind of permanent wariness, a flinching away from hope because hope could be ripped away without warning. By the time the milking was finished and the milk transferred to the cooling tank, the sun had begun to lighten the eastern sky, turning it from black to deep blue to the pale gold that promised a clear day. Thomas washed his hands at the utility sink, scrubbing until the skin turned red, then walked back to the house to make coffee. The kitchen was small and cluttered, dominated by a table that had once seated four but now held only one plate, one cup, one set of silverware pushed to one corner. Bills were stacked in the center, held down by a coffee mug. Thomas did not need to open them to know what they said. Past due. Final notice. Payment required. The coffee maker sputtered and hissed, filling the kitchen with a smell that was more memory than pleasure. His wife had loved coffee, had started every morning with a large mug that she carried from room to room as she got ready for the day. Thomas drank it now out of habit rather than enjoyment, adding too much sugar because that was how Jacob had taken it, perpetually sweet-toothed despite being nearly a grown man. He sat at the table with his coffee and pulled the bills toward him, forcing himself to look at the numbers. The mortgage payment was 3 months behind. The equipment loan was overdue. The feed supplier had threatened to cut him off if he did not make a payment by the end of the month. The veterinarian, who was a decent woman who had known Jacob and attended his funeral, had been patient about her invoices, but even patience had limits. Thomas did the math on the back of an envelope, adding and subtracting, trying to find a configuration of payments that would keep the farm running for another season. $300,000 would solve everything. It would clear the debts, repair the equipment, buy him time to figure out whether the farm could survive or whether he was simply delaying the inevitable. But even as he thought it, he knew the money was not why he was going back to the fairgrounds. The money was justification, a rational explanation he could offer if anyone asked. The truth was more complicated and harder to articulate. The truth was that something about midnight called to him in a language he had forgotten he could speak. Thomas finished his coffee, washed the cup, and left it in the drainer to dry. He changed into cleaner clothes, a different flannel shirt and jeans without holes, then climbed into his truck. The engine turned over reluctantly, coughing blue smoke before settling into an uneven idle. He needed to replace the spark plugs, add that to the list of things that required money he did not have. But the truck ran, and that was enough. The drive to Willow Creek took 40 minutes, following roads that curved through valleys where mist still clung to the low places and aspen groves blazed gold against the dark green of pine forests. Thomas passed farmhouses where lights were coming on in kitchens, ranches where cattle grazed in pastures silvered with frost, and small roadside chapels that served congregations of a dozen families. This was the landscape he had known his entire life, a place where people measured wealth in acres and cattle rather than money, where neighbors helped each other through hard times because everyone understood that hard times were inevitable. He reached the Drummond Ranch Fairgrounds just after 7, early enough that the parking lot was nearly empty. A few trucks belonging to vendors and staff were scattered near the main buildings, but the crowds had not yet arrived. Thomas parked in the same spot he had used before, out of some superstitious sense that repeating patterns might lead to different outcomes, and walked toward the arena. The morning light was gentle here, softening the rough timber of the fences and making the red dirt look almost inviting. From inside the holding pen, Thomas could hear midnight moving, the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional snort. He walked to the rail and looked in. The stallion stood in the far corner, his coat catching the light in a way that made him look less like a living animal and more like something carved from obsidian. His mane hung in tangles, his tail was matted with burrs, and there were healing scrapes along his hindquarters that spoke of recent collisions with fences or gates. Thomas stood without moving, his hands resting lightly on the top rail, and simply watched. He did not try to call out or make himself known. He simply observed, the way he had learned to observe cattle, looking for the small signs that revealed inner states. Midnight's ears were in constant motion, swiveling and flicking, never at rest. His weight shifted frequently from hoof to hoof, never settling, never relaxed. His tail lashed irregularly, not in anger but in agitation, the way a person might drum their fingers when anxious. After 10 minutes, Midnight turned his head and looked directly at Thomas. Their eyes met across the distance, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that transcended species. He saw in those dark eyes the same exhaustion he felt every morning when he woke, the same wariness, the same bone-deep fatigue that came from being afraid for too long. He did not smile or make any gesture. He simply held the horse's gaze and breathed, slow and steady, as though his breathing could somehow convey what words could not. The moment broke when a door slammed somewhere behind the main building. Midnight's head jerked up, his body tensing, and he spun away, retreating to the far corner where he resumed pacing. Thomas remained at the rail, undisturbed by the rejection. Trust, he knew, was not built in moments but in the accumulation of moments, each one adding a small measure of safety to what had been previously only fear. Footsteps approached from behind, and Thomas turned to see Rebecca Holland walking toward him, a cardboard cup of coffee in each hand. She offered him one without speaking, and he accepted it, surprised by the kindness. They stood side by side at the rail, drinking coffee and watching the stallion pace. "You came back," Rebecca said finally. "I did. Have you decided to try?" Thomas took a long drink of coffee, letting the heat spread through his chest. "I have decided to ask for something. Whether Victor Drummond agrees is another matter." Rebecca glanced at him sidelong, curiosity evident in her expression. "What are you going to ask for?" "Time," Thomas said. "Not 30 seconds. Not a challenge. Just time to be near him without pressure or spectacle. Days if he will allow it. Mornings before the crowds arrive. A chance to let the horse decide whether he wants to trust." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That is a very different approach." "It is the only approach that makes sense," Thomas replied. "You cannot force trust. You can only invite it and then wait to see if the invitation is accepted." "Victor will not like it," Rebecca warned. "He wants drama. He wants the crowd to see something exciting. What you are describing sounds like watching paint dry." Thomas smiled faintly. "Then maybe he will say no, and I can go home and stop thinking about this." "But you will not stop thinking about it," Rebecca said. It was not a question. Thomas did not answer because they both knew she was right. Whatever had brought him here had hooks in him now, and walking away would require tearing them out, leaving wounds that would not heal cleanly. He finished his coffee and crushed the cup in his hand, then turned to face Rebecca fully. "When does Victor usually arrive?" "Around 8:30. He likes to make an entrance when the crowd is already gathering." "Then I will wait." They stood together in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher and the fairgrounds began to wake. Vendors arrived and started setting up their booths, the smell of frying sausages and fresh coffee mingling with the sharper scents of livestock and dust. A few early arrivals began to trickle into the parking lot. Families with children who ran ahead, shouting with excitement, and older couples who walked slowly, their movements stiff with arthritis and age. Katie Jensen appeared at some point, her camera already out, filming the empty arena as though it held secrets that only she could see. She noticed Thomas standing with Rebecca and approached cautiously, her steps hesitant. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "Are you going to try today?" Thomas looked at her, really looked, and saw not just a teenager with a camera but someone who carried her own kind of intensity, a seriousness that suggested she understood more than her years should have allowed. "I am going to ask for the chance to try differently," he said. Katie's eyes widened. "Differently how?" Thomas explained his idea, and as he spoke, he saw something shift in her expression. A hope so fierce it was almost painful to witness. When he finished, she nodded vigorously. "That is what he needs," she said. "Everyone has been treating him like an enemy to defeat, but he is just scared. I have been watching him for 2 days, and all I see is fear." "You have good eyes," Rebecca said approvingly. Katie flushed with pleasure at the compliment, then lifted her camera. "Can I film this? When you talk to Mr. Drummond, people should see that there is another way." Thomas hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of being recorded, but Rebecca touched his arm lightly. "Let her," she said. "Victor responds to publicity. If people see what you are proposing, it creates pressure for him to agree." Reluctantly, Thomas nodded, and Katie positioned herself near the platform, ready to capture whatever happened next. Victor Drummond arrived at 8:45 in his black truck, this time accompanied by 2 men in pressed shirts who had the look of business associates or lawyers. He stepped out with his usual confidence, his boots polished, his Stetson tilted at a jaunty angle. He was in conversation with the men, laughing at something one of them had said, and he did not notice Thomas standing near the platform until he was almost upon him. "Mr. Drummond," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the nervousness twisting in his gut. Victor stopped, his smile freezing in place, his eyes assessing Thomas with the quick calculation of a man used to sizing up potential threats or opportunities. "Do I know you?" "No, sir. My name is Thomas Whitfield. I run a dairy farm outside of town." Victor's smile warmed slightly, though his eyes remained calculating. "Farmer. Good. We need more working men in this country. What can I do for you, Mr. Whitfield?" Thomas took a breath, aware of Rebecca standing a few feet away, of Katie filming from her position near the bleachers, of the morning crowd beginning to gather and listen. "I want to enter your challenge," he said, "but not under the current terms." Victor's eyebrows rose. "Not under the current terms? I am afraid the terms are quite clear. 30 seconds, 3 feet, no tools." He spread his hands as though the simplicity were self-evident. "I understand," Thomas said, "but I am proposing something different. Give me 3 mornings. Dawn before the crowds arrive. No microphones, no spectacle. Just me and the horse. Let me work with him quietly. Let him become accustomed to my presence. Then, on the 4th morning, I will stand with him for 60 seconds. Not 30, 60. If he remains calm, if he allows me to stay without aggression, then I have met the challenge." Victor's expression shifted from amusement to something sharper, more interested. 60 seconds? That is double the current requirement. "Yes, sir. Because what I am asking for is more than what others have asked for. I am asking for time and space to build trust. That should be worth a higher standard." Victor was silent, his mind clearly working through the angles. The 2 men with him exchanged glances, and one of them leaned in to whisper something, but Victor waved him off. He looked past Thomas to where Rebecca stood, then to Katie with her camera, then to the gathering crowd that had begun to sense something unusual was happening. "Why?" Victor asked finally. "Why should I agree to this?" Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "Because everyone who has tried so far has failed using force or tricks or skill. You have proven that those methods do not work with this horse. But maybe there is another way. Maybe what he needs is not to be conquered but to be understood. And if I succeed, you will have something more valuable than another failed attempt. You will have a story." Victor's smile returned, slow and considering. "A story." He seemed to taste the word, testing its weight. "You are a clever man, Mr. Whitfield. Cleverer than you look." "I am a desperate man," Thomas corrected quietly. "There is a difference." Victor studied him for a long moment, and something in Thomas's honesty seemed to penetrate the showman's armor. Victor turned to the crowd, which had grown larger, people pressing close to hear the conversation. "Folks," he called out, not bothering with the microphone yet, his voice carrying across the fairgrounds through practice and confidence alone, "we have an interesting proposal. This gentleman, Mr. Thomas Whitfield, has asked for a modification to the challenge. He wants 3 mornings alone with midnight. No crowds, no pressure. And in exchange, he will stand with the horse for 60 seconds instead of 30. He paused, letting the murmurs spread through the crowd. "What do you think? Should we give the farmer his chance?" The response was mixed. Some people shouted encouragement, intrigued by the novelty. Others protested, wanting the spectacle they had paid to see. But Victor was already nodding, his decision made not by consensus but by calculation. He saw the potential in the story, saw how it could be marketed, how it could draw even larger crowds for the final attempt. "All right, Mr. Whitfield," he said, extending his hand. 3 mornings. Dawn. Dr. Holland will supervise to ensure the horse is not being harmed or sedated. Deputy Morrison will verify fair play. And on the 4th morning, in front of witnesses, you will stand with midnight for 60 seconds. If you succeed, the $300,000 is yours. If you fail, his smile sharpened, you leave and we continue as before. Thomas shook his hand, Victor's grip firm and dry and conveying a kind of aggressive confidence that made Thomas's own hand feel rough and inadequate by comparison. "Agreed." Victor released his hand and climbed onto the platform, reaching for the microphone. His voice boomed across the fairgrounds. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just made history. For the first time since this challenge began, we are changing the rules. Mr. Thomas Whitfield, a local dairy farmer, will have 3 mornings to work with Midnight in private. And on the 4th morning, he will attempt to stand with the stallion for 60 seconds. Mark your calendars, folks. This is going to be something special. The crowd's reaction was enthusiastic. People already pulling out phones to spread the news. Vendors already calculating how many extra supplies they would need for the anticipated larger crowd. Thomas stood near the platform feeling suddenly exposed, aware of dozens of eyes on him, of Katie's camera pointed in his direction, of the weight of what he had just agreed to settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Rebecca appeared at his side, her expression a mixture of approval and concern. "You just bet your farm on a traumatized horse," she said quietly. "I know. Second thoughts?" Thomas looked toward the holding pen where Midnight paced, the stallion's dark form moving with restless energy. "Too late for second thoughts now." Rebecca nodded. "Dawn tomorrow then. I will be here. And Thomas," she added, her voice dropping lower, "I hope you know what you are doing. Because that horse has been failed by every human who has ever handled him. If you fail him too, I am not sure there will be anything left to save." Thomas had no answer for that. He simply nodded and walked back to his truck, aware that he had just committed himself to something that might be either redemption or ruin, and that there was no way to know which until he tried. The parking lot was filling rapidly now, families arriving for a day of entertainment, and Thomas had to maneuver carefully to get his truck out without hitting anyone. He drove home through morning sunshine that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the gravity of what he had just done. His mind raced with doubts and plans, trying to imagine how he would even begin to approach Midnight, what he could possibly offer a creature that had been given every reason to hate and fear humans. The $300,000 seemed simultaneously too much to risk and not enough to compensate for the impossibility of the task. When he reached the farm, the cattle were waiting in the yard, having been let out to pasture by the automated system he had installed. They lifted their heads as he passed, regarding him with the mild curiosity that cattle brought to most things, then returned to grazing. Thomas parked the truck and sat for a moment, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, his heart hammering with a combination of fear and something he was afraid to name. Inside the house, he made himself a sandwich he did not eat and coffee he let grow cold. He tried to do paperwork, to focus on the mundane tasks of farm management, but his mind kept drifting back to the stallion. Finally, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, he gave up on productivity and simply sat on the porch, watching the light change across his fields. He thought about Jacob, about the dreams they had shared for this farm, about the future that had died on a bright summer day when a tractor rolled. He thought about his wife, about the way grief had created a chasm between them that neither could bridge, about the phone calls that had grown shorter and less frequent until they had stopped entirely. He thought about all the ways a person could be broken, and all the ways those breaks could be hidden beneath the surface, invisible to everyone including yourself. As the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, Thomas made himself a promise. Tomorrow morning, when he stood before Midnight in the quiet before dawn, he would not try to fix the horse. He would not try to heal him or change him or make him something other than what he was. He would simply try to be present with him, to offer the kind of witness that said, "I see your pain and I am not afraid of it because I carry my own." It was not much of a plan. It was barely a plan at all. But it was honest, and in the end, honesty was all Thomas had left to offer. He went inside as darkness fell, set his alarm for 3:30, and lay down on top of his covers without undressing. Sleep came eventually, fitful and populated by dreams of running through fields where the grass grew taller than his head and something dark and beautiful always stayed just ahead, forever out of reach but never quite gone. The alarm shattered the darkness at 3:30, and Thomas was already awake, staring at the ceiling where shadows gathered in the corners like spectators waiting for a performance. He silenced the clock and rose, his body stiff from lying motionless for hours in a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness but some uneasy compromise between the two. The house was cold, the furnace not yet having kicked on for the morning, and his breath formed pale clouds as he dressed in the darkness. He pulled on thermal underwear beneath his jeans, added an extra layer under his flannel shirt, and grabbed the canvas work jacket that hung by the door. September mornings in Montana carried the warning of winter in their bones. Outside, the world existed in shades of black and deep blue, the stars still bright overhead, but beginning to fade as the first hint of dawn approached from beyond the eastern mountains. Thomas walked to the barn and completed the morning milking in near silence, moving through the routine with automatic precision while his mind circled endlessly around what lay ahead. The cows sensed his distraction, shifting restlessly in their stalls, and Rosie gave him a reproachful look when he forgot to scratch behind her ears the way he usually did. By the time he finished and cleaned the equipment, the sky had lightened to charcoal gray, and he could see the outline of the mountains against it, dark and jagged like the teeth of some vast creature. He made coffee in a thermos rather than a cup, knowing he would need it later, and added a few apples from the bowl on his counter, though he was not sure if horses even liked apples, or if that was just something from children's stories. His hands shook slightly as he twisted the thermos lid closed, and he had to force himself to breathe slowly, deliberately, pushing back against the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. The drive to Willow Creek was dark and solitary, his headlights cutting tunnels through the pre-dawn murk. He passed houses where lights were beginning to glow in kitchen windows, ranchers and farmers starting their own days, and he felt a kinship with those distant lights, with the people behind them who rose before the sun because animals needed care and land needed tending regardless of how tired you were or how much you wanted to stay in bed. The highway was empty except for a single semi-truck hauling livestock, its red taillights disappearing around a curve ahead of him. Thomas reached the Drummond Ranch Fairgrounds just after 5, early enough that the parking lot was completely empty except for a single truck he recognized as belonging to Rebecca Holland. She had parked near the main gate and was standing beside her vehicle with her hands wrapped around a travel mug, her breath visible in the cold air. When Thomas pulled in beside her and climbed out, she nodded in greeting but did not speak immediately, as though understanding that the morning required a certain kind of silence. Rebecca was dressed in layers like he was, practical clothing meant for standing in the cold for extended periods. She carried a clipboard under one arm and a small medical kit over one shoulder, prepared for any emergency that might arise. Her eyes, when they met his, held a combination of encouragement and wariness, the look of someone who had seen enough bad outcomes to be cautious, but enough good ones to maintain hope. "Ready?" she asked finally, her voice low. Thomas was not sure how to answer that. He was here, which was a kind of readiness, but whether he was prepared for what came next was something he would only discover by attempting it. "As ready as I can be," he said. They walked together toward the holding pen where Midnight had spent the night. The stallion was already awake, his dark form visible against the lighter timber of the fence. He stood in the center of the enclosure, his head high, his ears tracking their approach long before they were close enough to see his eyes. Thomas could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow, the sound of an animal on high alert. Rebecca stopped a good distance from the fence and set down her medical kit. "I will be over here," she said quietly, "close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough that I am not adding pressure. Take your time. There is no clock running this morning." Thomas nodded and walked the remaining distance alone. He stopped at the fence line and wrapped his hands around the top rail, feeling the cold wood against his palms, grounding himself in the physical sensation. Midnight watched him, every muscle in the stallion's body coiled tight, ready to explode into motion at the slightest provocation. The space between them was perhaps 30 feet, but it felt like miles. Thomas did not try to call out or make any sound. He simply stood, his weight balanced, his breathing slow and even. He thought about what Rebecca had said, about how the horse had been failed by every human who had handled him, and he tried to imagine what that kind of accumulated betrayal would do to a creature whose survival instincts were already wired toward vigilance and flight. He tried to imagine carrying that much fear every day, that much expectation of pain. Minutes passed. The sky continued to lighten, moving from charcoal to slate to the pale gray that preceded actual sunrise. Thomas's hands grew numb on the rail, but he did not move them. His legs began to ache from standing still, but he did not shift his weight. He simply stood and breathed and waited, making himself into a presence that was neither threat nor demand, simply there. Midnight's ears flicked forward, then back, then forward again. His weight shifted from hoof to hoof, a dance of indecision. Thomas could see the stallion's nostrils flaring, testing the air, trying to gather information about this human who was behaving differently than all the others. After perhaps 15 minutes, Midnight took a single step toward him. It was not an approach so much as an investigation, a cautious movement into slightly less distance. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain still. He did not smile or speak or make any gesture that might be interpreted as either encouragement or threat. He simply allowed the moment to exist without trying to shape it. Midnight took another step, then stopped. His tail lashed once, a sign of agitation, but he did not retreat. They stood like that, the distance between them reduced by perhaps 5 feet, while the morning continued to brighten around them. Behind him, Thomas heard the soft scratch of Rebecca's pen on her clipboard, documenting whatever she was seeing. He heard the distant cry of a hawk beginning its morning hunt, the rustle of wind through the pines that bordered the fairgrounds, the far-off sound of a vehicle on the highway. But mostly he heard his own breathing and Midnight's breathing, two rhythms that were not quite synchronized but were beginning to find a common pace. The sun broke over the eastern mountains, sending shafts of golden light across the valley. The light hit Midnight's coat and transformed him, turning the flat black into something that seemed to hold depth and dimension, a darkness that contained other colors if you looked closely enough. Thomas saw for the first time the individual scars that marked the stallion's body, the places where hide had healed over old wounds. He saw the way Midnight's left ear had a small notch missing, the way his right front hoof showed signs of having been improperly shod at some point. These were the records of the horse's history, written on his body in a language of damage. Without conscious thought, Thomas began to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper, not directed at Midnight so much as simply existing in the space between them. "I know what it is like," he said, "to carry wounds that nobody else can see. I know what it is like to wake up every day expecting more pain. I know what it is like to be so tired of being afraid that the fear itself becomes exhausting." Midnight's ears swiveled toward him, catching the sound. The stallion's body remained tense, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a subtle softening that might have been imagination but felt real enough. Thomas continued speaking, the words coming easier now, spilling out in a quiet stream. "I had a son. His name was Jacob. He was 17 years old, and he died 4 years ago in an accident that should never have happened. It was nobody's fault and everybody's fault, and it broke something in me that I do not think can be fixed. My wife left because staying here was like living in a graveyard. I do not blame her. Sometimes I think I should leave too. Sell this place and start over somewhere else. But I cannot make myself do it because leaving would feel like abandoning him all over again." The words hung in the cold air, and Thomas realized he had just spoken truths he had never voiced to another living person. He had barely admitted them to himself, had kept them locked away in the dark corners of his mind where they could not be examined too closely. But here, in the dawn light, standing before a traumatized animal who had no capacity to judge or advise or offer meaningless comfort, the words had found their way out. Midnight took another step closer, then another. He was perhaps 15 feet away now, close enough that Thomas could see the slight tremor in his legs, the way his nostrils continued to flare with each breath, the intelligence in his dark eyes that suggested he was processing information at a level deeper than simple stimulus and response. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes, unexpected and unwelcome, and he blinked them back. "I am not here to fix you," he said quietly. "I do not think I have the right to try. I am just here to stand with you, to see if maybe we can both survive being this broken without having to pretend we are whole." The moment stretched and held. Midnight stood perfectly still, his body taut as a wire, his gaze locked on Thomas. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stallion lowered his head. It was not submission, not exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement. A recognition that this human, at least, was not demanding anything he could not give. Rebecca's voice broke the spell, gentle but necessary. Thomas, that is remarkable. He has closed half the distance on his own. I have never seen him do that with anyone. Thomas released a breath he had not realized he was holding. His hands ached from gripping the rail, and when he loosened them, the blood rushing back in felt like tiny needles. He did not turn to look at Rebecca, did not want to break the connection by shifting his attention. "How long have we been here?" he asked. "Almost 40 minutes. Thomas was startled. It had felt like both seconds and hours, time losing its usual meaning in the intensity of the moment. He glanced at the sky and saw that the sun was now fully above the mountains, the light spreading across the valley in a way that meant the rest of the world would soon be waking, that the day would begin its ordinary progression of work and obligation. "I should let him rest," Thomas said. "This was enough for today." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "That is exactly the right instinct. Leave him wanting more rather than pushing until he shuts down. Come back tomorrow at the same time." Thomas finally turned away from the fence, breaking eye contact with Midnight slowly, giving the stallion time to adjust to the shift. He walked back to where Rebecca stood, his legs stiff from standing motionless for so long. She was writing notes on her clipboard, her handwriting precise and methodical. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Timestamps, distances, behavioral observations. If this works, if you succeed, I want a record of how it happened. Too often in animal behavior work, we only document the failures. I want to document a success. What if it is not a success?" Rebecca looked up at him, her expression serious. "Then at least we will know what was tried. That matters too." They walked back toward the parking lot together, the morning now fully established, birds calling from the pine trees and the first warmth beginning to soften the edge of the cold. Thomas's truck sat where he had left it, patient and waiting, and seeing it made him realize how surreal the past hour had been, how he had entered a space that existed outside normal time and was now returning to the regular world. Rebecca paused at her truck. "You did well," she said. "Better than I expected, honestly. You have good instincts." "I do not know if they are good instincts or just desperation," Thomas replied. "I am making this up as I go. Sometimes those are the same thing." She opened her truck door, then paused. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Why are you really doing this? I know you said you need the money, and I am sure that is true. But there is something else. I can see it in the way you look at him." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "When I look at him," he said finally, "I see myself. I see what I have become over the past 4 years. Trapped and angry and so afraid of being hurt again that I push away anything that might require me to hope. And I keep thinking that if I can help him find a way out of that trap, maybe I can find a way out of mine." Rebecca's eyes softened. "That is a lot of weight to put on one horse." "I know. But it is the only weight I seem to be able to carry right now." She nodded, understanding in her expression. "Tomorrow morning then. Same time." Thomas climbed into his truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his mind replaying everything that had happened. 40 minutes. Half the distance. A lowered head. It was not much, measured against the enormity of what Midnight had suffered and the impossibility of what Thomas had agreed to attempt. But it was something. It was a beginning. He drove home through a morning that had fully arrived, the valley bright with sunshine, the aspens glowing gold against the evergreens. He passed the same houses he had passed on the way in, but now people were outside, loading trucks, working in yards, living their lives. Thomas felt separate from them, as though he existed in a parallel reality that sometimes intersected with theirs but mostly ran along its own track. At the farm, the cows were waiting to be let out to pasture. He opened the gates and watched them amble through, their movements unhurried and content, so different from Midnight's constant tension. He envied them their simplicity, their ability to exist in the moment without the weight of memory or the burden of anticipation. They ate and slept and produced milk, and that was enough for them. Thomas could not remember the last time anything had been enough for him. He went into the house and made himself breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast that he ate standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt too formal, too much like pretending this was a normal day. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock on the wall. Jacob had given him that clock for Father's Day 6 years ago, a simple thing purchased with money earned from summer work. Thomas had promised himself he would never take it down, would let it run until the mechanism finally gave out, and even then he thought he might keep it on the wall, frozen at whatever time it stopped, a monument to a moment when his son had been alive and thinking of him. He washed his dishes, dried them, put them away. He paid 3 bills online, watching the numbers in his checking account dwindle to almost nothing. He made a list of farm tasks that needed completing and then ignored the list, instead walking out to the upper field where Jacob had died. He did this sometimes, though less frequently now than in the first year. He walked to the spot where the tractor had rolled and stood there, trying to feel some connection to his son, some sense of presence. But there was never anything except grass and wind and the weight of absence. "I met a horse," Thomas said aloud, addressing the empty field. "He is broken like I am broken, and I think maybe we can help each other. Or maybe I am fooling myself. I do not know anymore. I do not know anything except that I cannot keep living like this, frozen in the moment you left." The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere a meadowlark sang, its song bright and careless. Thomas stood until the cold began to seep through his jacket, then walked back to the house. He tried to work on paperwork, to organize the chaos of bills and invoices and agricultural reports, but his concentration was scattered. His mind kept returning to the arena, to the moment when midnight had lowered his head, to the feeling of recognition that had passed between them. By early afternoon, Thomas found himself standing in the doorway of Jacob's room, a space he had not entered in months. His wife had kept it pristine after their son's death, dusting and straightening as though Jacob might return at any moment. After she left, Thomas had simply closed the door, unable to deal with the shrine she had created. Now he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as Jacob had left it. Banned posters on the walls, a desk cluttered with textbooks and notebooks, a bed with a blue comforter pulled halfway up in a teenager's approximation of making it. Trophies from baseball and track lined a shelf above the desk, plastic gold figures frozen in athletic poses. Thomas picked up a photo from the nightstand, a picture of Jacob at 15, grinning broadly with his arm around a friend whose name Thomas could no longer remember. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress creaking under his weight, and allowed himself to really look at the room for the first time in years. He saw all the plans his son had made, the college brochures stacked on the desk, the applications half filled out. Jacob had wanted to study agricultural engineering, had talked about coming back to the farm with new ideas and modern techniques. He had wanted to make the dairy operation more sustainable, more profitable. He had wanted to take what his father had built and make it better. Thomas set the photo down carefully and stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the fields stretching toward the mountains. This had all been for Jacob, the endless work and sacrifice and determination. Thomas had told himself that if he could just keep the farm running, just hold on until his son was old enough to take over, then everything would have been worth it. Jacob's death had stolen not just a person but a purpose, had left Thomas operating machinery with no clear destination. Standing in his son's room, looking at the evidence of dreams that would never be fulfilled, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It was not acceptance, not exactly, but a kind of recognition similar to what he had felt with midnight that morning. He could not bring Jacob back. He could not undo the past 4 years of grief and isolation. But maybe, just maybe, he could stop living as though his own life had ended on that summer day. He left the room and closed the door behind him, but this time it felt different. Not like sealing a tomb, but like marking a boundary between past and present. Jacob would always be his son, and the pain of losing him would always be part of who Thomas was. But that pain did not have to be the only thing he was. Thomas returned to the kitchen and opened his laptop, the old machine taking its time to wake from sleep mode. He navigated to his email and found the folder where he had been saving messages from his wife. They had started as daily exchanges after she left, then weekly, then monthly, and now they came only occasionally, updates about her new life in Missoula, careful inquiries about the farm that never quite asked about him directly. He clicked on the most recent message, sent 3 weeks ago. She had written about her students, about a little girl who reminded her of someone they used to know, about how the aspens were turning early this year. At the end, as always, she had written, "I hope you are taking care of yourself." He had never responded to that line, had never known how to answer a question that assumed he was capable of self-care when most days he was barely capable of function. Thomas hit reply and stared at the blank screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and after several false starts, he began to type. "I am trying something new. There is a horse here in Willow Creek, a stallion that everyone says cannot be helped. He has been hurt so badly that he sees every human as a threat. I convinced the owner to let me spend time with him, to see if maybe patience can do what force could not. I do not know if it will work. But this morning, for the first time in 4 years, I felt like maybe there was a point to getting up. Maybe there was something worth trying for. I know you needed to leave. I know staying here was killing you slowly. I do not blame you for choosing life over memory. But I want you to know that I am trying to make that same choice now. I am trying to find a way to keep living even though part of me died with Jacob. I do not know what happens next, but I wanted you to know that something is happening. Something is changing, and I thought you would want to know that." He read the message 3 times, his finger hovering over the delete button more than once. But finally, with a sense of stepping off a cliff into unknown air, he pressed send. The message disappeared into the ether, and Thomas closed the laptop, his heart pounding as though he had done something dangerous rather than simply honest. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Thomas napped fitfully on the couch, dreams fragmenting before he could hold on to them. Images of Jacob and midnight blended together, a boy's laughter mixing with a horse's scream, sunshine and shadows trading places until he could not tell which was memory and which was fear. When he woke, disoriented and sweating despite the cool air, the light was slanting through the windows at the angle that meant evening was approaching. He made himself dinner, a sandwich and soup from a can, and ate it while watching the news on the small television in the living room. The stories were the usual litany of problems and conflicts, politicians arguing, disasters striking distant places, the steady drumbeat of human suffering that the news presented as entertainment. Thomas found himself thinking about how much of the world's pain was broadcast daily, how much trauma was turned into spectacle, and how little of the healing ever made the news. Success was quiet. Recovery was slow. Nobody filmed the moment when a broken person managed to get out of bed and face another day. He turned off the television and sat in silence, listening to the house settle around him. His laptop chimed, indicating a new email, and Thomas felt his stomach drop. He opened it to find a response from his wife, sent less than an hour after his message. "Thomas, I am glad. I am so glad. I have been worried about you for so long, but I did not know how to reach you. You built such high walls after Jacob died, and I could not find a way through them. Maybe the horse can do what I could not. Be careful. Be safe, but also be brave. You deserve to find your way back to living. I miss you. Not the way I used to, not with the hope that we might find our way back to each other. But I miss the man you were before grief swallowed you. I hope you find him again. I hope the horse helps you remember who you were." Thomas read the message twice, tears blurring the words on the screen. There was loss in her message, an acknowledgement that what they had been to each other was over. But there was also love, a different kind than they had shared before, more generous and less possessive. She was releasing him to become whoever he needed to be next, and in doing so, she was giving him a gift he had not known he needed. He closed the laptop and sat in the gathering darkness, not bothering to turn on lights. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, the same stars that had witnessed his son's death and his marriage's ending and every lonely night since. They offered no comfort and no judgment, simply the assurance that the world continued its rotation regardless of individual suffering. Thomas thought about tomorrow, about returning to the arena, about whether midnight would remember him or whether each day would require starting over from the beginning. He thought about the 60 seconds he had promised to stand with the stallion, about how impossible that seemed even after this morning's progress. But more than anything, He thought about the way it had felt to speak his grief aloud, to name the wound he had been carrying. There had been a strange kind of relief in it, as though by voicing the pain he had given it shape and dimension, had transformed it from a formless ache into something that could be examined and perhaps, eventually, set down. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but maybe no longer the only thing that defined him. As darkness settled fully over the valley, Thomas made himself a promise. Tomorrow he would return to midnight, and he would bring not just his presence but his honesty. He would continue to speak his truth to the stallion, to offer the kind of vulnerability that he had withheld from every human in his life. And maybe, in the process of helping a traumatized horse find peace, he would stumble upon some measure of peace himself. Thomas went to bed early, knowing that tomorrow would begin before dawn, knowing that he needed whatever rest he could get. But sleep was elusive, and he lay in the darkness thinking about broken things and whether they could ever be made whole, or whether the best you could hope for was learning to live with the cracks. He thought about midnight standing in his pen, probably awake like Thomas was awake, both of them waiting for morning with a mixture of dread and something that might almost be hope. Somewhere in the valley, coyotes began their evening song, their yips and howls carrying across the miles. Thomas listened to them, their wild music a reminder that the world was full of creatures that survived despite hardship, that adapted and persisted and found ways to thrive even when circumstances were harsh. If they could do it, maybe he could too. Maybe midnight could too. Maybe survival was not about being unbroken but about finding reasons to keep going despite the breaks. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, marking the passage of time with their slow rotation. And in a small farmhouse where too many rooms sat empty, a man waited for morning, hoping that the connection he had felt was real and not just wishful thinking, hoping that tomorrow would bring him one step closer to an answer he could not yet name but desperately needed to find. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.